From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start with a check on the markets, as we usually do. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, we like to think of it as all about the government here at Balance of Power. How much of this is sort of risk off because they're not sure about this stimulus package?
I would say a lot of it has to do with the government and the fact that the stimulus, it's a stall. The big stimulus that investors and traders had banked on for weeks back in the end of 2020 that would come through quickly. We have this stall, the $1.9 trillion. It doesn't appear to be passing anytime soon. So on this, over the last few days, we have had a little bit of a pause, even an unwind of the reflation trade. On the day right now, we have the S&P 500 down just a little bit, down 0.1%. There was a real risk-off moment, though, about an hour ago, though, David, telling you about the jitters investors have when the S&P 500 and the other indexes all down more than 1%. At this point, some of the more reflation-sensitive indexes, those are down even more, including the banking index, small cap, and the Dow transports. Behind us, of course, David, one of your favorite topics, bonds. We have the best rally for bonds going all the way back to November. So as yields come back in, that is certainly hurting those sectors and areas that had done well on the prospect of big stimulus and reflation.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Abigail. Great report on the markets from Abigail Doolittle. So now we want to turn to the Biden administration. It continues its 10-day to-do list today with an executive order on his Buy America policy. To take us through what we expect, welcome now our Washington correspondent, Emily Wilkins. So, Emily, as you point out, in fairness, that's not the only executive order. There was one involving transgender participation in the military. But the Buy America really goes to his economic policy.
Absolutely. It's a huge part of Biden's policy to try and strengthen Americans' economy. Now, the policy, it's actually similar to one that we did see Trump sign when he was president. But basically what this is meant to do is to encourage federal agencies to buy American products and also specify what American products are, because there are some loopholes that allow companies right now to be able to have employees overseas and build certain pieces overseas, but still get to qualify for this domestic benefit. And so Biden's trying to close the loopholes, really encourage companies to make sure that they are hiring American workers, using American factories, and then making sure that the federal government will purchase those American-made products.
And Emily, in the meantime, we just heard from Abigail that the markets and business is really paying attention to that stimulus package. Is it going to come, and when is it going to come? Give us a sense. It felt like it slowed down maybe a little bit over the weekend. They started selling it to a bipartisan group up on the Capitol Hill, but it feels like there's getting some resistance.
The bipartisan group had a lot of questions for Biden, mostly why do we need a $1.9 trillion stimulus when we just passed a $900 billion stimulus back in December? Chuck Schumer came out today, the Senate Majority Leader, saying that he's expecting about 1 month to 6 weeks to come to an agreement. Even that might wind up being a little bit ambitious. Remember, for the deal back in December, it took them months and months of negotiations to come to that. But the Biden administration is hoping that with their election and their concentrated work with lawmakers on this, they can come to some sort of agreement. There's also been discussion at this point about passing a more narrow bill, perhaps something that looks strictly at vaccines, which once again is another major priority for the Biden administration.
Okay, our Washington correspondent, Emily Wilkins. Thank you so much, Emily, for being with us today. We know what the Biden administration wants for stimulus. The question is what they can actually get. And as we just heard, there's been some resistance, including from moderate Republican senators like Susan Collins, who told Business Insider, quote, "We just passed $900 billion worth of assistance. Why would we have a package that big? Maybe a couple of months from now, the needs will be evident and we will need to do something significant, but I'm not seeing it right now." To take us through what is really doable at this point, we welcome Henrietta Trays. She is Veda Partners, Director of Economic Policy. So, Henrietta, thank you so much for being with us. What is doable in your estimation right now?
Thanks for having me, David. I think that there are as many as 2 separate bills that could pass in the next couple of months here. Time is obviously important, but we've got to keep that March 14th time horizon in the back of our minds. That's what I spoke to moderate Democrats about yesterday. Is that really a deadline for us to use when the unemployment insurance benefits booster payment rolls off? And the answer is yes. So sometime in the late February to mid-March timeframe remains our horizon. I don't think investors should anticipate something moving much more quickly than that. This is really difficult to pull off, whether you go for 60 votes in a bipartisan bill or you act alone under reconciliation. I think what you'll see here is aid to vaccines has a lot of support on a bipartisan basis. And the direct payment does also. The question is really more of who will get the checks and what the scope will be. You don't see a lot of pushback from even moderate Republicans saying, oh, no, people are fine. Nobody needs more aid. It's just a matter of how much. So cutting the Biden ask of 1.9 trillion in half is a great place to start. And I do think that there is still at least a 70% chance that we get a bipartisan package through Congress in the next few weeks and months. After that, we'll get a reconciliation bill that'll be exclusively deficit spending. And one of the things I'm hoping investors take away from this first couple of days is just appreciating how difficult it is to sign a bill into law. It's really hard. So assuming that there will be massive tax increases, either at the corporate level or the individual level, is similarly unrealistic. And I think that that's something that could help investors sort of set parameters for what's to come.
So you mentioned two alternatives there, regular order, as they say, which would actually require 60 votes, as I understand, to get past the filibuster in the Senate, or doing a reconciliation. There's a difference, is there not, in the timeline of those two things? One you can do faster than the other.
Exactly. And that's a great point. A 60-vote bill you could take up and pass before the end of February. A reconciliation package needs to go through first a fiscal year 2021 budget process. The budget chairman in the House, Representative Yarmouth, will have to bring that up in the House. And then to the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Bernie Sanders, will have to bring up his in the Senate. They'll need to write that entire budget, take the time and energy, which is days and nights of vote-a-rama votes to get that budget passed, reconcile them between the House and the Senate. Before we even finish that, you're probably at the end of March. And then you've got to write the bill to spend the money that the budget authorizes. So a second quarter event is much more realistic to think of for a reconciliation bill, whereas with a bipartisan 60-vote threshold package, you could get that out by the end of February. And for reference, that's what Barack Obama was able to do in 2009 when Vice President Biden at the time was able to secure bipartisan support for a very similar bill that spent $831 billion, as we know, as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So those are our two options. The reconciliation bill will take much longer.
In case that's not complicated enough for us, we also have another little pesky thing called impeachment up there. They're going to have a trial. It appears the week of February 8th. Is it really possible for them to do both at once? We hear from Democrats, oh, yeah, we can do both. Is that right?
I don't think so, if I'm honest. And I think that behind the scenes, a lot of moderate Democrats and even, liberals or Republicans would say the same thing. You might get some nominees confirmed for the Biden cabinet before the impeachment trial starts. We've obviously seen several, and they're optimistic that Pete Buttigieg, for instance, at the Transportation Department could get his confirmation, as well as a few others before the February 8th start date for the trial. But as I heard from one staffer last night, I don't think that legislation is realistic to anticipate while the former president is being impeached by the Senate. That is probably a bridge too far. So I think that what you'll see is some nominees, maybe some technical committee assignments being worked out, but actual legislative advancement would happen after the trial, which would already put you at late February. That doesn't mean they can't work on it at the same time. They just can't pass it.
So, I mean, I don't want to push too far. We might go too far with this, but that's before you get to sort of the build it better part of it. Things like infrastructure that they're talking about, a massive thing. Given what you've just described, they're going to be pretty busy for some months now. When could we realistically expect anything moving forward on infrastructure?
I think if they are able to get a bipartisan bill on COVID relief, you're probably not going to see another bill pass until we have one of the two big deadlines in the spring and summer. That's the Memorial Day recess and then the July end of session period before the August recess. Those are traditionally when you get the most action out of DC. If you have to go through that process I laid out before, the fiscal year budget, and then writing the reconciliation bill, which is going to require several different committees of jurisdiction weighing in, you're probably looking at late May or even July before you see that bill pass. And that should be what investors expect. This is not a fast-moving train. They move slowly. They only pass a couple bills a year. It will be a massive spend, but it's going to take several months to write that bill before it becomes a situation where money is flowing out the door.
Henrietta, let me come back to something you referred to, and that is possibly breaking this into pieces, because the thing that I think everybody in the country is most anxious about right now is getting that vaccine. And some of the money they're asking for is to get that done. People seem to think that that is required. What are the prospects of actually President Biden being willing to split that part off and get that done right away?
I think it's very realistic, quite frankly. Obviously, we heard from the NEC director yesterday or last week that they're not willing to split the bill in pieces just yet. But if you take a really long-winded look at what Biden has accomplished in his 36 years as a senator and his 8 years as vice president, he prioritizes bipartisanship. His inauguration speech was all about that. I think his press secretary, Jen Psaki, has been very clear about that in the press briefings. They want a bipartisan moment. And if that is associated with COVID relief and, specifically the vaccine, maybe some small business aid and a direct payment to individuals, that's sufficient, in my opinion, to get them really moving. And then the Democrats know they have the potential to pass not one, but two deficit spending reconciliation bills in this calendar year. And they're, I think, more comfortable than people anticipate with taking a little bit of time if they can first get that bipartisan bill out.
Henry, finally, do we know yet who's driving this bus from the administration's point of view? I mean, we had Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, drive it more or less for President Trump. Is it going to be, who's it going to be this time? Brian Deese?
Brian Deese is obviously very involved with the bipartisan group of senators and some House members in the Problem Solvers Caucus. They had a meeting yesterday. They are expected to talk again sometime in the next 2 days, and I anticipate he will be very hands-on. The Biden team, one of the things that's much different from the Trump administration years is a lot of these staffers are folks who have worked on Capitol Hill in the House, in the Senate, for various members, and they know how to connect with those staffers on both sides of the aisle. So I expect it'll be an all-hands approach, not just one person.
Henrietta, really great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That's Henrietta Trey. She's Director of Economic Policy at Veda Partners. Coming up, we turn to the virus and Dr. Fauci sounding the alarm over delaying second doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. Details ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. As you alluded to moments ago, the nation's top infectious disease expert says he's worried about a push to delay administering the second dose of COVID-19 vaccines to speed immunizations. Speaking at the Davos Agenda event hosted by Bloomberg's editor-in-chief John Micklethwait, Dr. Anthony Fauci also talked about the weaknesses of the U.S.'s response to the pandemic.
When public health issues become politically charged, like wearing a mask or not becomes a political statement, you cannot imagine how destructive that is to any unified public health message.
Dr. Fauci says he's concerned because the vaccine is not fully effective until the second dose is administered. New York City will delay opening vaccination megasites at Yankee Stadium and Citi Field as shortages leave the city unable to meet its goal of 1 million doses by the end of the month. Mayor Bill de Blasio says the city received about 100,000 fewer doses last week than it had expected from the federal government. Mayor de Blasio said the city is equipped to vaccinate 500,000 people a week if it gets a supply increase. Former Trump White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders is running for governor of Arkansas. The move was expected. Sanders left the White House in 2019 to return to her home state. In a video announcing her candidacy, Sanders said that with the, quote, radical left now in charge of Washington, the governor is the last line of defense, end quote. She is the daughter of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. I want to follow up on Mark's reporting on Dr. Fauci's concerns about that second vaccine dose. This is how Dr. Fauci put it earlier today on a World Economic Forum panel.
You don't get full efficacy until you get that second dose. And if you allow suboptimal efficacy, you could actually immunologically select more for mutations when you do that. So that's the reason why, it may not be the case, but it gets risky. And that's the reason why we prefer to keep it on the time that the clinical trials said.
For an update on the vaccine program, we welcome now Michelle Cortez, who covers healthcare for Bloomberg. So, Michelle, thanks for being with us. Picking up on what we just heard from Dr. Fauci, as I understand it, I'm not an immunologist, and what he said is if you don't do right by that second dose, you could actually exacerbate the problem of the mutations we're seeing already.
You're exactly right. That is what Dr. Fauci is saying. And of course, that's coming at this critical period of time when we are starting to vaccinate many, many people. The virus doesn't think. All it does is replicate, and it works around any hurdles that get in its way. So as we're getting these vaccinations happening, people are starting to develop some set of immunity. So the virus is looking for its workarounds. As we're doing more and more of these, the virus is trying to survive, so it will find more workarounds. If you delay the efficacy, we do see some levels of efficacy, about a 50% benefit after that first shot. But basically, that's just kind of showing your hand to the virus that could allow it to do that workaround, and then you might get more variants developing, more that could actually help it transmit faster and be more deadly. And that's exactly what we need to avoid here.
Well, exactly, Michelle. And just give us a sense from your reporting, the public health officials, how worried are they about these mutations? Because what I'm hearing now is, wait a second, it's mutating so that it is more virulent than it was before, and certainly more contagious. It may be that we can't catch up for a longer period of time with the vaccine. It's running ahead of us in a sense.
Well, it is definitely like playing whack-a-mole, and that is something that public health officials don't expect is going to ever end at this point. As you say, we're now hearing that the variant in the UK might actually be more deadly in addition to spreading more quickly. The South African variant is concerning because it appears to be potentially evading the vaccines that we have already. So there's good news on this as well, though. We heard today from Stefan Bancel, who is the CEO of Moderna. He said that their vaccine, just like Pfizer's vaccine, does appear to be effective at this moment against that variant, but it is less effective than against the wild type. So while we're losing some benefit of the Moderna vaccine, it's still better than if you were naturally infected with that particular variant. But he's concerned that what's going to happen is in the next 6 to 12 months, the virus will figure out a way to get around the vaccine. So the good news for them is that they are starting work, they're announcing today, on basically their second-generation vaccine that's targeting the South African variant.
Well, that's great news about a second-generation vaccine, but I got a news for you, Michelle. We don't have enough of the first version yet. I mean, how long is it going to take before we can really ramp up the supply so we're not having, for example, in New York, they had to shut down some of their plans for the mass vaccination sites?
Yeah, there is definitely not enough vaccine, although I would have to argue the fact that, if you don't have enough, that's still better than if you have one that doesn't work at all, right?
Fair enough, yeah.
Again, this first year, it's just so astonishing how much progress we have made. But you're 100% right. I did some back-of-the-envelope math this weekend to figure out where we are with this. We are pretty close to getting the 1 million doses a day that we would need in order to meet President Biden's 100 million doses in the first 100 days of his presidency. But Dr. Fauci said this weekend that he thinks that we need 70 to 85% of Americans vaccinated, even if you take that lower figure, and he's hoping to do that by the end of the summer. If you look at the number of days we have until the end of the summer and the number of people in America, if you do that 70% figure, that's basically a push. But we do need to have 2 vaccines. So that means we would need to be at the 2 million a day distribution. We need to be vaccinating 2 million Americans a day in order to get to 70% coverage by the end of the summer, and that's going to be really difficult.
Really difficult. It's good just to have the benchmark. Thank you, Michelle. That helps me. That's Michelle Cortez of Bloomberg, who reports on healthcare for us. Coming up, an interview with France Finance Minister Bruno Maire as part of the virtual World Economic Forum. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
I'm Guy Johnson, subbing in for the generous David Weston for a few minutes. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. We're also joined by our listeners on the cable here in the United Kingdom. Let's turn to the virtual World Economic Forum in Davos. I'm joined now by France's Finance Minister, Bruno Le Maire. Minister, thank you very much indeed for your time this evening. It is now expected that France will announce a further lockdown this week, a national lockdown. Are you preparing to announce additional fiscal support for French business and their employees when this happens?
First of all, on the lockdown, I just want to insist on the fact that nothing has been decided yet. We will have a very important meeting on Wednesday with President Macron. We will assess the health situation and then take the required decisions. But once again, nothing has been decided yet. Our policy is quite clear. We will support all the economic sectors that are badly hit by the crisis as long as it will be needed. And if we are to take new measures, we will have also to provide new support to the sectors that will be more severely hit by these measures. It must be very clear that we stand beside those sectors. We have decided from the very beginning, from March 2020, to support the employees, to support the companies, to support all the sectors that have been hit by the crisis. And we will continue to do the same as long as the pandemic will continue to strike France and Europe.
How long do you think that support is now going to be required for? Are you starting to change your thinking about the duration of this pandemic? There was an assumption that, for instance, the travel and tourism sector would be back to normal by this summer. That is increasingly being called into question. Are you starting to rethink the duration of this?
I think that back to normal is the kind of wording that I would not use for the time being, because it would be too tricky. Our assumption is that we have to divide the year 2021 in two parts. In the first part of the year 2021, let's say till next summer, I think that we will have to continue supporting some of the economic sectors in France. And once again, we have decided to do so from the very beginning. It would be a political, a social, and an economic mistake to withdraw that kind of measures while the pandemic is still there. But I hope that in the second part of 2021, we will be able to lift the measures for health security. We will be able to alleviate that kind of difficulties. And in that case, if the pandemic is over, I think that we can count on a very strong rebound of the French economy on the second part of 2021. And what makes me really confident about the situation, the economic situation in France, is that when we have decided on the summer 2020 to lift the measures for the health measures, then there has been a very strong rebound in the French economy, which means that we have everything that is required to have a very strong and very quick rebound as soon as the pandemic is over.
Minister, within the last couple of seconds, we have news from Italy, where the Italian Treasury is now saying that it sees 2021 GDP growth as low as 4.5%. You've indicated that your 6% target for this year is, quote, challenging, and that forecast is dependent on no further lockdowns. How much do you think your targets, your 6% target, could suffer if, as you say, a decision potentially could be made Wednesday that could install a further lockdown?
Let's be very clear. I made very clear from the very beginning that the 6% was a challenge, and that this challenge is directly linked to the health situation. If there is a lockdown, but once again, nothing has been decided yet on this lockdown and on any further measures. But if there is a decision of lockdown in France, of course, it will have direct impact on our growth forecast. And it will be very difficult to reach 6% of growth if there is a lockdown decided in a few days or in a few weeks. But this should not be a surprise for anybody, because we have been very clear from the very beginning on the assumptions and on the way we have defined the level of growth for 2021. The 6% is a challenge. I think that we can reach it, provided that there is no new health measures and no new lockdown in France.
We'll see what happens later on this week. As you said, this is going to be, well, you think this is going to be a game of two halves, that the second half of the year is likely to look better. One of the factors behind that is likely to be the progress that is going to be made on vaccinations. France is currently lagging behind on vaccinations. Why is that happening, and what impact do you think it's going to have on the French economy?
You know, from the very beginning of January, President Macron made very clear that we had to accelerate on the vaccinations. And you can see the results now. We have 1 million people being vaccinated by the end of January. So we are on the right track. And I think that this decision of accelerating the campaign of vaccination was the right one. We can see the positive results of this decision from President Macron. And of course, there is a direct link between the success of the vaccination and the possibility of having a very strong economic rebound by the end of this year. We are on the right direction once again. And the fact that the vaccination campaign has accelerated is good news for all of us.
Minister, I'm wondering when you are scheduled to talk to Janet Yellen, the incoming Treasury Secretary in the United States, depending on the votes. When is that conversation going to happen? What do you think the focus of that conversation will be? And do you worry that the European Union's new trade deal with China may make relations with Washington a little bit more difficult?
I hope to have the possibility of talking to Janet as soon as possible in a few days. But first of all, we are waiting for the confirmation from the US Senate. So I want to stick to the American procedure, of course, and I'm waiting for the formal confirmation from the US Senate. And then we will have a lot of topics that we will have to address. But I know Janet Yellen very well, and I'm sure that we will have a very constructive relationship on many topics. The first one will be, of course, international taxation. And the very first statements made by Janet Yellen on international taxation clearly mark a change in the American position on the right direction on digital taxation and on minimum taxation, especially. The second issue that we will have on the table, even if it is not exactly in the scope of the responsibilities of Janet Yellen, will be the necessity of withdrawing the sanctions against the EU and doing our best efforts to find an agreement on the trade questions, and especially on the Boeing Airbus case, but because clearly this is a matter of concern for all of us here in Europe. And the last point will be, as you just said, the relationship with China. I think that we have to do our common efforts, the US and Europe, to engage China into a more constructive relationship on the international stage and incentivizing China to obey by the international rules on intellectual property, for instance, or on the level playing field. And I hope that we will be able to have a common view on this approach towards China.
Minister, thank you for your time today. It is greatly appreciated. The French Finance Minister, Bruno Le Maire, from the World Economic Forum. Back to you.
Thank you so much to Guy Johnson for that timely and really important interview with the French finance minister. To get a readout on particularly what they talked about at the end there with coordination, possible coordination with the United States, we turn now to our colleague Bill Ferries, who covers international affairs and national security issues in Washington. So, Bill, I know that President Biden had the first talk with President Macron of France over the weekend, supposedly about NATO and about climate. Two things I guess they would be inclined to agree upon.
Exactly. I think what we've seen from President Biden so far is a much more traditional outreach to allies on, areas of common interest, things that they can work together on. The first call was Trudeau in Canada, and of course, historically in the pre-COVID times, the U.S. president generally made his first trip to be one to Canada and then Mexico. Now that we're in COVID and the pandemic, he made his calls to Trudeau and the Mexican president, and then started the outreach with the UK and other European allies. But yes, they're going to focus on areas in common: NATO, climate change, any coordination they can on COVID issues as well.
Well, about the COVID issue coordination, Bruno Maire, the French finance minister we just heard from, has said he would like to have more coordination on things like the stimulus package, $1.9 trillion. Is that likely to happen?
Well, I think from the Biden administration's point of view, their focus is getting any kind of package at this point. We've seen a lot of pushback from both moderate Republicans and some Democrats on that package. So I think the Biden administration is going to worry a lot more about the domestic politics for now than the international politics.
Okay, Bill, always great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. That's our colleague, Bill Ferries. We turn now from foreign relations in the Biden administration back to the subject that is affecting all nations around the world, and that is, of course, fighting the pandemic. As everyone races to get as many people vaccinated just as soon as possible, we continue to rely, though, on treatments for the millions already infected. Centevax is one of the companies working on such treatments using something called computational immunoengineering to find breakthrough medicines. We welcome now the company's CEO. He's Dr. Jacob Glanville. Welcome. It's great to have you with us. I have to say, I think you could start explaining to me exactly what computational immunoengineering is.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. It's a mouthful, but what it really means is that we use advances in computation as well as wet lab practices to try to produce better medicines. The first generation of antibody therapies have worked okay. They didn't work in the hospital. They're not very convenient to deliver outside of the hospital because they require an IV. And so the doctors who can give an IV are busy giving it to more sick patients. So the last issue, of course, is that the new mutations that are emerging around the world, many of them are interfering with the initial wave of antibodies to be able to provide treatment. We've used our engineering techniques to design antibodies that bind a conserved location on the virus that it hasn't been able to mutate, an Achilles heel. We've also engineered it so that we can concentrate our antibodies into a syringe so that people can get a convenient injection when they get sick early and they don't need to go to a hospital. So those are advances to make a better medicine to help us treat the pandemic, which is important. Vaccines are great and we need them, but realistically, given the rollout, the new mutations, and the global scale of the problem, we need a medicine to be able to treat patients so that we can reduce a medical crisis to a manageable infectious disease. And so that's what we're working on.
So I want to make sure we all understand what I think you just said, which is when it comes to the mutations that everyone's very concerned about right now. We heard from the Moderna CEO on Bloomberg earlier today saying they're working on that. They think it could be effective, but on some maybe not. What you're saying is is it monoclonal antibody treatment? Is that what it is?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a monoclonal.
But you believe that actually can deal even with the mutated virus?
That's correct. So we've all been watching this all year. All viruses mutate, and what we've seen are there's these new mutants popping up in South Africa. There's one in the UK and in many other locations. Some of those mutations interfere with the vaccines, so that's why Moderna says they're going to need to adapt their vaccine. And then the same is going to be true of the Pfizer vaccine. But they also really interfere with antibody treatments because antibodies bind one spot on the virus, and if that spot mutates, then that antibody doesn't work anymore. So we spent some effort to try to pick an antibody that binds an Achilles heel on the virus that's really difficult for that virus to mutate. And so we've tested our antibodies so far on all of these scary new mutations that are popping up, and they're not affecting our antibody. And we think that gives an important advantage to be able to have a treatment that will still work when it's out for people in hospitals.
Can you make this available at scale? Certainly that's one of the things we're seeing right now with the vaccines for the COVID-19. You can't necessarily make enough of it fast enough, can you?
So there's an effort to make more doses, I think you've got two problems. With the current antibodies, they need to be given as an IV infusion, so it's an IV. And the problem is that doctors are going to triage out early patients. These current antibodies don't work in a hospital. They actually make things potentially worse. And if you're not in a hospital yet and you call in and say, hey, I just got sick, the first thing the doctor's going to tell you is like, look, we're dealing with more sick patients than you. Why don't you wait? The problem is by the time you wait enough to go to the hospital, then you're no longer eligible. So our approach is to give a highly concentrated dose early in an injection, which you can give anywhere. You could give that at CVS or Walgreens, and you can give the treatment early. The advantage also is a smaller dose is more effective earlier. So in order to manage manufacture, it's not impossible. It just requires international collaboration. So we have contacted over 500 different organizations that potentially can do contract manufacture for us, and we are intending on manufacturing at multiple sites. That, of course, is expensive, but it enables you to achieve the scale that's necessary. We think that about 30 to 60,000 doses a month is about what's going to be needed in the United States. That is achievable with the global manufacturing capacity.
What sort of financial assistance are you getting? Is it coming from the government?
We'd like to have more. So we've had some support from the armed forces, and we appreciate that in order to develop our molecule. And we're about to make an announcement about support for our phase 1 studies. So far, we're not beneficiaries of the large amounts of money released by BARDA, and then BARDA held off on releasing more. We understand that the new administration has a few $1 billion of additional resources, and we are appealing to BARDA and OWS and Active to be able to ensure, because we do need a large bolus of capital to activate all these manufacturing sites so that we have something ready after our phase 2. We can ask for emergency authorization, and we don't want to be stuck with no medicine. So that's something we're actively engaged in now.
This is really interesting and very helpful. We're all going to be amateur immunologists here before we're done. Thank you so much to Jacob Glanville. He is Centivac's CEO. Coming up, we'll discuss President Biden's climate agenda and the road ahead on stimulus with former Governor Christine Todd-Whitman, Republican of New Jersey. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. President Biden came to office promising bold action on the climate. And the day he took the oath of office, he issued executive orders on rejoining the Paris Climate Accord and stopping the Keystone XL pipeline project. Welcome now Christine Todd-Whitman, who served as a Republican governor of New Jersey and then became administrator of the EPA under President George W. Bush. So, Governor, thank you so much for being back with us. You know the environment. You know the EPA. What do you make of what President Biden, the new President Biden, has done so far?
Well, it's a refreshing start to admit that the climate is important, that the environment is important, and that this administration is going to do all that it can to ensure that we have a clean, safe, healthy environment, which can only help our economy. So I'm delighted to see it. We do need to take some steps domestically to prove that we're serious if we're going to get the rest of the world to listen to us on the issues of climate. But this is global. We're not going to be able to make all the difference ourselves, but we're not going to be an effective partner if the rest of the world doesn't trust us. And they've seen us before get them right to the edge of and change some of what they wanted to see in a particular accord, like the Paris Accord, and then back away from it. So it's good that we've re-engaged, but we're going to have to do some things domestically to ensure that we are serious about this. And this administration seems to be on that course.
When you say, Governor, we have to do some things, who's the we? Can the executive branch do it on their own? Can President Biden? We've seen a lot of executive orders already. There are some things clearly they can do. How much do they need Congress to enact legislation?
Well, it'd be much better if you can get Congress to do it. Executive orders are not the way, because they can be, as we see what's happening right now, being undone by a subsequent administration, which is what the Trump administration did. So this backing and forthing is what's causing problems in our international relationships as well as our domestic, for companies to understand what's going to happen, what's going to be demanded of them, because they need certainty more than anything else to make the investments that they're going to have to make. And so it would be much better if Congress acted. But right now, Congress can't even seem to get its act together to decide who is to do the power sharing. The Republicans still chair the committees. I don't think they got the message from this election and 2016, frankly, where the public said, we want action. We don't really care how you organize yourself. Get over it. But start acting on the important pieces of legislation, because we're facing some huge crises.
This is your party, the Republican Party. Give us a sense of where you think this party is headed, because it seems to be quite fractured right now. It's not clear to me where it's going.
Well, I'm not sure there is a Republican Party. There's a Trump Party. And then there are people who they liked what the President Trump was doing, but they didn't like the way he did it. So they were particularly turned off by the effort to overturn the election, but they're still not real Republicans in the sense that they're not wholly Trump people. And then there are the rest of us who said from the very beginning that this man didn't have the capacity or really the interest and the ability to be president of the United States. I'm not going to be surprised if you don't see a movement to develop a third party, the way the Republican Party started.
What is the risk of people just leaving, either the Republican Party or leaving office? We now have Rob Portman, who I think is perceived generally as sort of a moderate but very competent senator from Ohio, saying, I don't want to run again because it's just too partisan. I can't get anything done.
Well, that's the tragedy that we're facing right now. We've allowed ourselves to get so polarized. The good news is there is the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House and in the Senate. That's an equal number of Republicans and Democrats who agree to work together. And when 2/3 of them have taken a position on a particular issue, they'll vote as a bloc. And with both the House and the Senate being so closely divided, they're going to have a bigger say. But I think really the thing that's going to make the difference, because you saw the immediate reaction from some of these office holders, is what the corporations decide to do, what the big givers decide to do. If they really are going to make a commitment to trying to reestablish our democracy and get public confidence back in it, and that our government can work, they have a lot to say, because money drives so much of what's happening. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And that's what will really get the attention of these office holders and get them to start to put aside some of these petty differences, although important in the way the House and the Senate operate, but start to address the pandemic, the economic crisis, the unemployment. I mean, we have a host of really serious issues.
Well, and one of the ways that President Biden is proposing to address them is with his $1.9 trillion stimulus package. Some of that is for the states. We hear from a variety of states, some led by Republicans as well as Democrats, that really there needs to be some assistance in order to get the vaccinations going, in order to support the schools, things like that. What is your take as the former leader of New Jersey? What is needed in New Jersey?
Well, the same thing you hear from every state. They do need more of the vaccine. They need more support. They need more economic support. I mean, the economies of all the states and the municipalities have been hammered by this pandemic. A small business, particularly in New Jersey, is the engine that drives that state. And they're closing, and many of them are not going to come back. And so as big as this stimulus package is, and I know it scares a lot of people, but the Republican Party long ago walked away from a balanced budget. They've not been good fiscal stewards. But you're going to have to do something really dramatic. It's going to have to be big. We'll have to pay the price later. But right now, if we don't get this economy back on its feet, it's going to be an esoteric argument as to whether this is too big or not big enough. The states do need the help. There's no question about it. And they can do the job with direction from the federal government, something that they've lacked under the previous administration.
So it may be the right answer, but sometimes it's hard to get even to the right answer. Politically, do you think it is doable at this point, particularly in the Senate? As you pointed out, it's a little unclear what the power sharing is there right now, but presumably Senator Schumer will be able to bring things to the floor. Is it one thing to object to something in the abstract? Is it another thing to actually have to vote against it?
Exactly. And that's going to push a lot of these members. Again, that is where their supporters, their big donors, the people who have backed them all along will have a lot of influence and be able to say to them, look, we've got to get things going. We've got to get things back on track. So they're going to have an ability that's even larger than they've had in the past. It's going to be tough, though. As you've seen, Republicans are already backing away from we want to work together. How anyone could have listened to President Biden's inaugural address and find fault with his call for unity is beyond me. I mean, how do you interpret that as being an attack on someone? I guess if the label fits, you got to wear it. I guess it's the shoe fits, you got to wear it. But getting the analogy is a little mixed up there. But, it's something that we have to sit down and say, who are we? Where are we? What are we? And I thought that that President Biden's message, it was so starkly different than what we heard 4 years before from Donald Trump, who described America. I just didn't recognize at that point. So this unity is what we need, because that's the only way we can move forward in a way that brings both sides into the process to ensure that when the administrations change the next time, you're not going to get a wholesale reversal of programs. You do that only happens when you push things through with only one party supporting it. You have to have that bipartisan coalition to get these things through that last.
Okay, it's really always a treat to have you with us, I must say. That's Governor Christy Todd-Whitman. She was the former governor of the state of New Jersey. And coming up tomorrow, be sure to tune in for my wide-ranging conversation with the current New Jersey governor. He is Democrat Phil Murphy. Coming up, $145 million. That's the amount of anonymous donations President Biden's campaign brought in the past election cycle. Why the so-called dark money could spell trouble for his party ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Anonymous political donations, so-called dark money, has been a target for Democrats for years now. Generally, they've insisted on transparency, but it turns out that it was just that dark money that helped Joe Biden win the presidency, to the tune of some $145 million. Marty Schenker is our Bloomberg editor-at-large, and he joins me now. So, Marty, I guess you think better when you're getting paid or something. You change your mind.
Yeah, that's true. As I commented just earlier, all currency is green. It's not red or blue. And so, Bill Allison of our Washington Bureau did the story over the weekend showing just how much Joe Biden relied on dark money.
So the Democrats, as I recall, have typically been the ones who've said, we don't like dark money, let's have legislation disclosing. At the same time, is it kind of fair to say, look, we didn't get that legislation through, so why should we just let the Republicans take it?
Yeah, and that's one of the arguments that Democratic strategists made to us is that, are we going to unilaterally disarm during this election? So they decided to take this anonymous cash and run with it. Don't forget, Joe Biden raised $1.5 billion, that's in B, dollars. So while $145 million is nothing to scoff at, it's still just a fraction of what he was able to raise.
So, Marty, you'll know this better than I do, but my recollection is in the United Kingdom, basically, you can donate whatever you want, but you have to disclose. It's all transparent. And the theory is, boy, if you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, you'll get a lot of attention you won't want. What's wrong with that approach? To just say you can contribute what you want, but you got to tell us who you are.
Well, I mean, there are people who would argue that the disclosure actually inhibits participation in the political process because some people just don't want to be named. But at the same time, there are many ethicists who say that just putting that out there, who's giving money to which candidates, is truly a democratic principle that should be advanced.
So, Marty, go more broadly with me, if you would. Besides the dark money issue, there's a lot of calls from both sides for sort of reform of the process. Certainly you hear a lot of Republicans saying, we got to look into what went wrong, how can we fix it? There's always things we can improve in our democracy, in our voting system, including in the way we raise money. Is there any realistic prospect, as somebody who knows Washington so well, any realistic prospects we would actually get some political reform here?
Well, I tell you, with a Congress so deeply divided, 50-50 in the Senate, a small Democratic majority in the House, it's hard to see how campaign finance reform gets done. And you'll notice Joe Biden did not put that on the list of things he wants to accomplish in the first 100 days. And maybe it would take a more substantial majority from both either the Republicans or the Democrats in 4 years to get something done. But I don't see any major reform effort happening anytime soon.
Just quickly here at the end, is there any significant political leader who's really championing it? We remember John McCain did for years.
Actually, I'm not aware of anybody. Mark Whitehouse, the Rhode Island senator, someone who's spoken a lot about dark money, so he might be the one.
Okay, thank you so much. Always great to have Marty Schenker with us. He's our editor-in-large here in Bloomberg. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with Drew Littman, Policy Director at Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck and former Chief of Staff for Senator Al Franken, as well as former Policy Director for Senator Barbara Boxer. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on radio.